The Dunning-Kruger effect is one of those things that was initially a really valuable concept before the internet picked it up, oversimplified it, and misunderstood it, and then ran it into the ground to the point where even trying to meaningfully discuss it can be a challenge. It seems to validate the perception that a lot of us have that so many incompetent, unintelligent people are just unaware of how incompetent and unintelligent they are. The Dunning-Kruger effect also works pretty well as an insult on the internet because it's a nice two-for-one. It not only says that you're wrong, but it implies that you're delusional about your own level of intelligence. You think that you're a smart person saying something smart, but you're really an idiot saying something stupid. You think that you're really good at something, but everyone else can see that you clearly suck. The Dunning-Kruger effect is also something that's generally assumed to grow best in a vacuum. If you aren't regularly getting some form of objective outside assessment of your skills, then you don't have anyone or anything else to bring you back to reality, and it's easier to delude yourself about your own abilities. Last month, I conducted a study that I said was about evaluating how Overwatch 2 players felt about the ranked matchmaking system. I promoted a survey to get data for this study on my channel, on Twitch, and on Twitter, asking for respondents to tell me about their experience in the first competitive season of Overwatch 2, including their rankings in each role, the heroes that they played, and their opinions about the game's balance. In reality, this survey was collecting data to answer a very simple but very different question. Do Overwatch 2 players suffer from the Dunning-Kruger effect? Now, before we get into the actual video, I want to provide a quick update. Over the last couple of weeks, I've been running some polls to see which thumbnail for my channel is the ugliest of all time in your opinion. And I'm happy to announce, to the surprise of literally nobody, the winner of the final round was Video Games, Luck, and Shiny Pokemon. It is a true abomination of a thumbnail that took me probably at least an hour to make, and which I love with all my heart for how hideous it is. Now, back to the regularly scheduled programming. Actually, maybe grab a beverage now, this is going to be a long one. Part 1. The background on this study. This study was actually conceived as part of a university course into research methodology in the social sciences. I was tasked with developing a pilot study that explored some aspect of how human beings behave, including writing out a proposal, doing a literature review, conducting the study, and then presenting it. I chose to explore the Dunning-Kruger effect in Overwatch because, for one, I knew I could make a video out of it, and I might as well try and make back at least some of the money I've spent on this education, and for another, because there's actually very little research into this topic in this context. Academic research into video games is, in my humble opinion, pretty shit. It generally comes from people who don't understand video games well enough to know how or why you should study them, or, from people who just want academic validation over their hobbies and don't actually want to critically evaluate them or the people who play them. In this video, I don't just want to tell you about my findings, but also explain, how the study worked and the process of coming to a particular conclusion. As well, before we go any further, I do want to make sure we're all on the same page about what the Dunning-Kruger effect actually is. Despite how it's commonly used, the reality is that Dunning-Kruger is a bit more complicated than just dumb people think they're smart. Shocker to Twitter, I know. Someone being wrong about something, even confidently wrong, is not an indicator of the Dunning-Kruger effect's presence, especially if this is based on a subjective assessment of wrongness, or where it's an opinion of, oh, this person thinks this, but I think that, therefore they're the Dunning-Kruger. It's ridiculous how it's used on the internet. The Dunning-Kruger effect exists when there is a relationship between real skill and the size of the gap between real and perceived skill, specifically in terms of that gap being largest among low-skill individuals and narrowing, potentially even reversing, as the level of real skill increases. There are different theories for why the effect exists, but for my money, the Dunning-Kruger effect is less about pure delusion and more about assuming that humans are generally more competent than they actually are, and wanting to believe that you're about as competent as the average person. This doesn't just explain why the effect is a lot stronger in people who are lower skill, but also why the effect weakens as people improve their real skill level and get closer to the average, and can even reverse if they advance significantly beyond that average. I want to make it clear as well up front, none of this is a judgment against anyone who participated in the study at any rank, or anyone who's low rank who didn't participate. It is not a character flaw to have a low real skill level in Overwatch. If you're a bronze damage player who participated in this survey, this study, this video, they're not about judging you for that. Your data was really, really important. It was really valuable in helping to assess this, so thank you. In this context, we should also define the terms real skill and perceived skill, just to make sure there's no confusion. It might seem obvious that, real skill refers to someone's real skill level, while perceived skill refers to the skill level someone perceives themselves as holding. But the challenge there is, how do you quantify those two things in a way that you have something concrete to work with so you can see if there actually is a gap, or what the size of that gap is? So-and-so is good at Overwatch, or so-and-so is bad at Overwatch is not enough. We need to have a way to quantify what it means to be good or bad, or different levels of good or different levels of bad. And it's not just enough to have a measuring system for this, for measuring real skill. It also has to be a measuring system that the subject of your study understands well enough that they can accurately pinpoint what they perceive their skill to be on that system. And the measures that you use are inevitably going to have some flaws. An advantage of using Overwatch to study this is that the ranking system is about as good as it gets when it comes to meeting both of these criteria. The assessment of real skill is being done continuously and over time by a neutral, objective party, and everyone participating in a study on the subject will have a ballpark understanding of what each rank means. If I tell you that someone is Plat 2, everyone generally will understand what that means for that person. For this study, real skill is defined by a player's ranking in the first competitive season of Overwatch 2, including both their season high and their final ranking. And perceived skill is defined by what rank players felt like they should have had if the system was perfect. I want to reiterate, this was the first competitive season, the one that happened in October and November. It was called Competitive Season 0 for a while in game. That is the one we're talking about. This does not apply to Season 2, does not apply to Season 3, does not apply to any future seasons. If you are watching this in the future, please keep that in mind, okay? There have been some issues with this in past videos. To measure the gap between real and perceived skill, I just counted the number of divisions between a player's real skill level and their perceived skill level. This was done by conducting 3 basically identical surveys within the overall, meta survey, with one of those surveys each being focused on each role. Respondents were also asked to rank a series of statements about the game on a scale from 1 to 7 in each of those individual surveys that they were told were meant to evaluate how they felt the game was treating the role, but were actually meant to see if people felt differently about different roles. To demonstrate that this is the Dunning-Kruger effect, we need to be able to isolate that a player's real skill is the independent variable, and that the size of the gap between that player's real and perceived skill is the dependent variable on it. However, it's possible that the size of the gap between real and perceived skill is also influenced by other variables, and one of the big ones that I wanted to test is whether the Dunning-Kruger effect manifests equally in all 3 roles. If one role is, on average, more likely to fall victim to the Dunning-Kruger effect or demonstrate it to a higher magnitude, that could open up a whole new can of worms. I also really quickly want to explain the difference between anonymity and confidentiality in the context of a survey. Anonymity would mean that nobody knows the identity of the respondent, that it's completely anonymous, there's no way to trace it back. While confidentiality would mean that the researcher, in this case yours truly, was given some form of identifying information that they either promised to keep private from publication or replace with a code of some sort or otherwise, anonymize the data. In this study, I asked respondents for 2 pieces of identifying information: their email address and their Battle.net ID. Battle.net IDs were used to just ensure that there were no duplicate responses, and once the survey was closed, I did a quick check to ensure that there were none before deleting those from the database. The email addresses were then used to debrief respondents. Once the survey was finished and closed, all respondents were BCC'd on an email debriefing them, and then their email addresses were deleted from the database. I then went through the data and deleted the responses that were initially identifiable as unusable, as well as the day and time that their responses went in. The remaining respondents were assigned a random number between 1 and 100, and then further work was done to evaluate whether or not they were usable in terms of, filling out questions correctly, whatever, whittling it down to usable respondents that I could put towards this study. To maintain the confidentiality, respondents were only ever referred to by the random number they were assigned, like player 1, player 2, etc. Alright, I think I spent enough time, explaining the study. Let's move on to part 2, the data. As I mentioned earlier, respondents were basically asked to fill out 3 separate surveys, one for damage, one for tank, and one for support. In each survey, the questions were identical except for which role they were discussing, and respondents were allowed to not fill out data for roles they hadn't placed in, meaning that one respondent might have actually been a respondent 1, 2, or 3 times. By the time I had filtered out all the duplicate or invalid responses from the data, I had 82 valid respondents who yielded a total of 179 valid responses, with the respondents looking like this in terms of the roles that they were considered for. Almost half of all eligible respondents had placed in all 3 roles, while 22% of respondents only had support placements, 12% had both damage and support placements, 8% only had damage placements, 7% had damage and tank placements, and 1% either had only tank placements or tank and support placements. However, as mentioned, the survey was effectively done 3 times, and the responses were collected by identifying them as either damage responses, tank responses, or support responses, with all valid responses from all relevant groups being considered together. Of the 179 responses, 62 were damage responses, 48 were tank responses, and 69 were support responses. You can see that breakdown in the following chart. This means that across all 3 roles, the same people will be constituting a majority of the responses. You might argue that this is a flaw, but it actually helps with answering the question from before about whether or not the role in question plays a role in the Dunning-Kruger effect. Given that a pretty large majority of respondents in each role also responded to at least one other role's questions, we would really expect to see the responses maintaining some consistency. If they don't, then it's even greater evidence that the role plays a big role. Also, just as an FYI, this color scheme is going to be maintained as consistently as possible throughout the video to try and make the data as easy to follow as possible. Red is going to be used to represent damage, blue will be for tank, yellow will be for support. Going forward, in all future graphs, red will be used to represent all 62 responses included in the damage respondents bar, while blue will be used to represent all 48 responses in the tank respondents bar, and yellow will be used to represent all 69 responses in the support respondents bar. As mentioned at the top, this survey also involved lying to people a little bit. In conducting academic studies, you're generally not supposed to just lie to your respondents for fun. You need to ensure that if you do, you're following best ethical practices and you are doing it for a good reason. For this study, the reason for lying to participants was because the Dunning-Kruger effect is just super polarizing. And if I told people that that was the subject of the study, it would have likely influenced their responses. I needed people to come into this neutrally without thinking that they were being judged for their skills and their ranks, and this was a necessary part of that. To be clear, this was run past my professor to confirm this was ethically handled, and every respondent was sent an email about a week ago debriefing them on the study and explaining this to them. To make this deception convincing, there were a lot of superfluous questions that were asked about things like the heroes that people named, the region that they played in, or the player's average ping. This data could eventually be useful for deeper analysis about whether or not the effect was stronger among people who played certain heroes or played on certain ping levels, but given the low number of respondents compared to what would be necessary to draw conclusions about data like that, it just won't be considered here. In this survey, there were 13 distinct questions posed to respondents that were repeated for each role. The questions were worded the exact same in every version of the survey, with only the name of the roles swapped. For example, the question, "What was your final rank and division in competitive Season 0 of Overwatch 2 in the damage role?" would be rewritten as, "What was your final rank and division in competitive Season 0 of Overwatch 2 in the tank role?" and "What was your final rank and division in competitive Season 0 of Overwatch 2 in the support role in the tank and support surveys." First, what we're going to do is just go over all 13 of the questions and statements, and then after that, we'll go over the data from each one. So, the first 3 questions asked in each survey were: 1. What was your final rank and division in competitive Season 0 of Overwatch 2 in the damage, tank, or support role? 2. What was your season high rank and division in competitive Season 0 of Overwatch 2 in the damage, tank, or support role? And 3. If the ranked matchmaking system of Overwatch 2 were perfect at assigning players to the rank and division that most accurately reflects their skill, what rank and division do you believe that you would be at in the damage, tank, or support role? The first 2 questions were used to establish a range of real skill. In instances where the final and season high ranks were identical, then that single rank would be used as their real skill rank. And in instances where the final rank was lower than the season high, then the entire range of ranks between the season high and final rank were considered to be their real skill rank. If someone ended the season at Diamond 1 in the damage role and that was their season high, then their real skill for this study's purpose was Diamond 1. If they ended the season at Silver 3 but had a season high of Gold 4, then their real skill for this study's purpose was anywhere between Silver 3 and Gold 4. The third question assesses the respondent's perceived skill. If that hypothetical Diamond 1 damage player said that they perceived their skill level to be closer to Masters 3, then the size of the gap between real and perceived skill for that player in the damage role is 3. After those 3 questions, respondents were asked whether they agreed or disagreed with a statement on a scale from 1 to 7, with 1 representing strongly disagree, 7 representing strongly agree, and 4 representing neutral. Statements 1, 2, 3, and 7 were positive statements, or statements where agreement would signal that the player took responsibility for their own rank. Statements 4, 5, 6, and 8 were negative statements, or statements where agreement would signal that the players were blaming someone or something else for their rank. Statements 9 and 10 were unique in that they asked players to consider whether the role in question felt less impactful than the other 2 roles, with agreement indicating that the player felt that the other role was more impactful, and disagreement indicating that the player felt that the other role was less impactful than the one that they were talking about. Each of the first 8 statements began with the line, "When it comes to the damage, tank, or support role specifically," and went as follows. 1. I believe that a good damage, tank, or support player will be able to carry themselves to a higher rank if they deserve to be there. 2. I generally believe that I'm being placed in matches where I have a fair chance of winning. 3. I feel that the matchmaking system generally places me on teams with people who are at the same skill level as me. 4. I feel as though my rank has been negatively impacted by the balance decisions made by Blizzard. 5. I believe that the concept of ELO hell is real. That is, I believe that a player can be stuck at a lower rank than their actual skill level would justify and be unable to climb due to factors beyond their control. 6. I believe that my rank has been affected by ELO hell. That is, I believe I'm stuck at a low rank that does not reflect my skill level because of factors beyond my control. 7. I believe that heroes are generally proportionally rewarding in terms of the skill required to play them. That is, I believe that easier heroes in the damage, tank, or support role are also less capable of having a big impact than the more challenging heroes in the damage, tank, or support role. 8. I feel that my rank in competitive Season 0 was lower than it should have been due to the competitive meta being unfavorable towards the heroes I prefer to play. The last 2 statements turned into 3 datasets, which are presented as follows. 1. When I am playing in the damage/tank role, I generally feel I am less capable of influencing the outcome of the game than someone of equal skill playing the support role. 2. When I am playing in the damage/support role, I generally feel I am less capable of influencing the outcome of the game than someone of equal skill playing the tank role. 3. When I am playing in the tank/support role, I generally feel like I am less capable of influencing the outcome of the game than someone of equal skill playing the damage role. What we're hoping to do here is be able to use these 13 questions/statements to see if the Dunning-Kruger effect is present. In other words, is there a relationship between a player's real skill level and the size of the gap between their real and perceived skill? And if there is, can we identify whether that effect is consistent across all 3 roles? I hope you're as excited as I am to review the numbers on this. Part of me wants to actually apologize for being such a numbers nerd, but frankly, you're, I don't know, 15 minutes into a video about a research study conducted on Overwatch players about the Dunning-Kruger effect. We're all nerds here. I refuse to apologize to you. Starting with questions 1 and 2 to assess real skill, here is a breakdown of what that looks like. Just a reminder, remember the color scheme is that red represents damage, blue represents tank, yellow represents support, purple represents the average from across all roles or the collective response from across all roles. I also want to reiterate that later on in the video, I'm going to be discussing some critiques and some flaws of this study, which will include things like the sample size, because while this data definitely already shows some trends, we also can see that there is not a consistent number of respondents across each rank and role, such as having no Masters level tanks or Grandmasters level damage players. However, now we get to move on to the exciting question, question 3, and that's the one that covers the perceived skill of players. This is the big question. We would expect that bronze and silver players will generally demonstrate the biggest gaps in real and perceived skill, with that gap getting smaller in gold and platinum and shrinking even further for diamond, masters, and grandmasters players. And so, moment of truth. How big is the size of the gap between real and perceived skill by rank? Ta-da! Across all roles, which is the purple line, remember, the size of the gap definitely does get smaller as real skill increases. Dunning-Kruger. The only exception to the trend is the Grandmasters, but that can honestly kind of be chalked up to the fact that there were only 2 respondents in that rank, one of whom agreed with their rank and the other of whom felt they should be 2 divisions higher, which really is not a very big gap. However, we can also see that this line isn't super consistent when we break it down role by role. Bronze level damage players had a shockingly small gap, especially compared to bronze tanks and supports, while silver tanks had a much smaller gap than silver damage players or supports. Meanwhile, the supports were the only role that was consistently either equal to or greater than the average across all roles, and the gap was larger than all other roles at every level past gold. And remember, a majority of the respondents across all 3 roles were the same people. This data would indicate that it's not just that support players are uniquely delusional, but perhaps that the average player, when they play support, feels particularly hard done by when it comes to ranked Overwatch. But this is where the 10 agree/disagree statements come in. We can check and see how each of the 3 roles compares to one another in their responses to see if maybe there are some specific issues that people feel are impacting the roles differently, or might explain why these weird anomalies are happening in some cases. Starting with statement 1. I believe that a good damage, tank, or support player will be able to carry themselves to a higher rank if they deserve to be there. Already, we can see a big difference in how support players, particularly at the lowest ranks, perceive the game. Damage and tank players at every rank agreed on average with the sentiment that a good player in that role will be able to carry themselves to a higher rank if they deserve to be there. Interestingly, bronze damage players were actually the most likely to agree with the sentiment across all damage players, which might help explain why they had an unusually low real perceived skill gap. The tank players generally agreed with the sentiment more as they climbed to higher ranks, while damage players went in a bit more of a wave. Support players generally agreed more as real skill increased, but they were still far less agreeable than the other roles, and bronze, silver, and gold support players were the only ones in this study who actually disagreed with the idea that if you're good, you can climb. Next statement. I generally feel that I'm being placed in matches where I have a fair chance of winning. And this one gives us a lot of insight into how players feel, because on average, people were pretty neutral, but it does vary in some interesting ways by rank and role. Supports in bronze, silver, gold, plat, and masters all disagree with the idea that they're generally being placed in games where they have a fair chance of winning, as do damage players in silver and tanks in bronze and silver. Personally, I find it fascinating that across all ranks, both damage and support players erred on the side of disagreeing with this statement, while tanks were an outlier. Maybe an indication that tank players, given the unique role of the new 5v5 format, feel a lot more in control of the outcomes than anyone else. Next statement. I feel that the matchmaking system generally places me on teams with people who are at the same skill level as me. This is the first time that, across all ranks, all 3 roles were on the same side of an issue. Love to see it, even if it's barely across the average for the supports. Across all roles and ranks, only bronze damage players, masters damage players, and supports, and the Grandmaster tank felt like they were being placed on teams with people at the same skill level as themselves. Across all ranks, damage players and tanks were both pretty close to one another, and supports were about 0.5 behind on average. However, I think the most interesting part of this is that the low point actually appears to be in silver and gold. Bronze players, on average, disagreed with the statement less strongly than silver and gold players did, with supports and tanks disagreeing most strongly in silver and damage players disagreeing most strongly in gold. Remember how I said a minute ago that the first 3 statements were positive ones where we'd expect that agreement would indicate that people are more willing to accept their rank's validity? Given that the average responses across all ranks and roles were 4.96, 3.85, and 3.31 respectively, not doing great in terms of an accurate assessment of reality so far. However, on to the next one. I feel as though my rank has been negatively impacted by the balanced decisions made by Blizzard. Remember that this was specifically in the context of the first competitive season of Overwatch 2, which might be able to help explain a couple of these responses. But outside of bronze and silver, people were generally pretty neutral on this one. Honestly, I was a little bit surprised. I figured that there would be a lot more agreement on this, but people seemed to not really blame Blizzard that much for their ranks being low in the first season. The only exception to that is the bronze tanks, which is the only time so far that they've really stuck their necks out and helped to explain maybe why the bronze tanks had the single biggest gap between real and perceived skill. Next, I believe that the concept of elo hell is real. That is, I believe that a player can be stuck at a lower rank than their actual skill level would justify and be unable to climb due to factors beyond their control. This statement was very deliberately worded like this. I had assumed that higher ranked players would generally not feel like they'd been negatively impacted by elo hell because by definition, elo hell is only supposed to apply in low ranks. However, they might still believe that it exists for those lower skill players, and that's what I wanted to check for. The differences between players who believe that the concept was real versus those who felt negatively impacted by it. What we can see is that, across the board, supports overwhelmingly believe elo hell is real more than everyone else, with tanks being the least likely to believe in it. Supports were also the only ones at any rank to err on the side of agreeing with this statement. At most, the silver tanks and damage players were neutral on it. But now we've got to ask, who felt the most affected by elo hell? I believe that my rank has been affected by elo hell. That is, I believe I am stuck at a low rank that does not reflect my skill level because of factors beyond my control. As someone who plays a lot of support myself, I'm afraid we're never beating the martyr complex allegations. Supports were the most agreeable at every rank with this statement, although to be fair, only the silver supports actually leaned towards agreeing with it. However, the way more interesting piece of data here is, at least in my opinion, bronze players are less likely to feel personally attacked by elo hell than silver players. Like, isn't that weird? Like, okay, elo hell isn't real. All evidence points to it legitimately just being a coping strategy for the Dunning-Kruger effect. In fact, a discussion about this with a friend was actually what inspired the study initially. However, if elo hell were real, wouldn't it be in bronze? Why do silver players feel more pressed than bronze players about elo hell? Is it possible that bronze players tend to be more likely to think that they could be better but they just don't play enough or something? While silver players tend to be people who are putting in the effort but are just hitting a ceiling? It's interesting to consider, and I kind of want to make a whole separate video specifically about elo hell because this video is already way too long to get into it, but it is a really interesting phenomenon as a cope. Anyways, on to the next statement. I believe that heroes are generally proportionally rewarding in terms of the skill required to play them. That is, I believe that the easier heroes in the damage, tank, or support role are also less capable of having an impact than the more challenging heroes in the damage, tank, or support role. This was actually a really interesting outcome. Remember, Statement 7 was considered to be one of the positive statements where agreement could be seen as an indicator of everyone accepting that individual skill determines outcomes. However, pretty much across the board, almost everyone seems to feel like heroes aren't proportionally rewarding in their roles. I would be curious if this particular statement would get a different response in a different season with a different meta, or if it was worded differently. But aside from the diamond supports, everyone was either neutral on this sentiment or disagreed with it, with the metal ranks all disagreeing pretty strongly. I do also think this is a little bit notable that this is the only instance so far where the supports have been more agreeable with a positive statement or disagreeable about a negative statement, even if they were still generally on the side of disagreeing with the positive statement in this case. On to the final normal statement. I feel that my rank in competitive Season 0 was lower than it should have been due to the competitive meta being unfavorable towards the heroes I prefer to play. And this is also a really interesting one. Except for the bronze damage players continuing to be a weird anomaly, this almost forms a reverse bell curve. Bronze players tended to feel like they'd been disadvantaged because the meta wasn't favorable to their mains, a sentiment which declined as the ranks increased until it bottomed out at Plat, and then it actually grew in Diamond and Masters. Across all ranks and roles, players tended to disagree with the statement though, and for once it was actually the tanks consistently being an outlier as opposed to the supports, so gold star supports, you did it. Alright, last chunk of data. Remember, these last two statements were broken up into 3 datasets. One for how damage players and tanks felt about their role relative to supports, one for how damage players and supports felt about their role relative to tanks, and one for how tanks and supports felt about their role relative to damage players. I'm going to do a short analysis of each chart and then analyze all 3 together to see if we can get anything out of that. So, when it comes to how damage and tank players feel about the support role, it's pretty interesting. Across all the metal ranks plus diamond, both damage players and tanks disagreed with the sentiment, hitting a high in silver and then a low in platinum and diamond. However, the Masters damage players and the Grandmasters tank player both felt like the supports could be way more impactful than their respective roles at their respective ranks. Remember, this wasn't the first season, it was before the Dead by Daylight season. These responses might reflect that the meta was different back then. Next, onto how the damage and support players felt about tanks. Again, interesting. Across the board, both damage and support players generally seem to feel that the tanks are more capable of having an impact than they are. Supports agreed with this statement more than damage players at every rank, with, the only support rank where it dropped below a 5 being the sole Grandmaster support, while the highest damage agreement came from Gold and Diamond where it topped out at 5. Bronze damage players were the only ones to actually disagree with this sentiment, interestingly enough. And lastly, for how tank and support players feel about the damage role. This one would generally line up with what we saw from the last two. Supports agreed that damage players were more able to have an impact than them, which lined up with damage players generally feeling the same way. Likewise, tank players at every rank disagreed pretty strongly with the idea that damage players could have more of an impact. Alright, so what do these three charts tell us? Well, the main one is that everyone agreed that the tanks were running the show in the first season. Tanks overwhelmingly felt like they were more capable of having an impact than a damage player or a support of equal skill, and damage players and supports generally agreed with that idea. Damage players and supports also generally seemed to agree that damage players were more capable of having a bigger impact than supports were at the same rank. Although interestingly, damage players were a lot more confident in that assessment than supports. The only exceptions in a lot of this were at the very top. Masters damage players and Masters supports equally agreed with the statement that their role was less capable of having an impact than the other. And the sole Grandmaster tank and support were respectively outliers in all relevant datasets. We've assessed this data in isolation, but what can it tell us as a whole? Part 3. Analysis. In the actual study that I conducted, the full form of the research question that I asked was, will low-skill players of a competitive video game with a codified ranking system involving individualized real skill evaluations still demonstrate a large gap between their real and perceived skills that would indicate the presence of the Dunning-Kruger effect, while average skill and high skill players demonstrate the reduced or reversed gap between real and perceived skills that would similarly indicate the Dunning-Kruger effect's presence? It's a wordy question, but based on the data, I think we can confidently answer this question, yes. At the very lowest ranks, players demonstrated a large average gap between their real and perceived skills, and that gap did shrink as the ranks climbed higher. However, we also need to reckon with the fact that the Dunning-Kruger effect didn't manifest equally across all three roles. Bronze damage players and silver tanks were notable exceptions to the trend, with real perceived skill gaps that were much smaller than the respective bronze and silver average gaps, and bronze damage players throughout the entire survey were consistently a bizarre exception to the trends at all other ranks and roles. On top of that, supports, besties, were not coming out of this one looking too great. Not only did supports have the most consistent relationship between real skill and real perceived skill gaps, they also routinely were the most likely to disagree with the statements that involved accepting personal responsibility for their rank, and were most likely to agree with statements that involved assigning responsibility for their rank to another culprit. However, we need to also remember that the majority of the support responses also came from people who were the majority of the damage responses and the majority of the tank responses. The data might actually indicate that it's not that supports are more delusional than DPS or tanks, like I said before. Rather, maybe the issue is that playing support is what makes someone more delusional about their rank. We also need to consider that the Dunning-Kruger effect was not only strongest among supports, but weakest among tanks. Why? Was there any other data that might help us understand why this happened? Well, yeah, the final three datasets reflected that everyone generally agreed with the idea that supports were the least capable of having an impact out of the three roles, while tanks were generally the most capable of having that impact. If it was just support saying that, it would be one thing. It would suggest that supports felt hard done by, but that the sentiment was internalized, it was theirs, no one else shared it. However, that sentiment is shared across the damage and tank respondents that I had in this study. We also need to remember that a majority of responses from each role, again, came from the same people. If you played all three roles and you agreed with the sentiment that tank was the most impactful, damage was in the middle, and support was the least impactful, wouldn't it be a logical conclusion that your support rank is probably the one that you would identify as being the furthest away from where it theoretically would be in a perfect matchmaking system, while your tank rank is the one that's closest? However, on the other hand, does this actually disprove the conclusion that the Dunning-Kruger effect is strongest among supports? At the end of the day, not really. The fun thing about the Dunning-Kruger effect is that it's a self-defending concept. If you are assessed to have a low real skill level, then any argument you make that you deserve a higher assessment is kind of proving the point. A support who says that, it's not my fault that I'm low ranked. The support role is the least impactful in my rank and everyone agrees. I'm not being delusional when I say that I would have a higher rank if the game was balanced better or was working better or whatever. It can be used against you. Then again, what if they're right? What if this is actually a flaw in the logic of the Dunning-Kruger effect itself? This isn't built to handle a system where equal levels of skill can yield variable measurements of real skill thanks to an asymmetrical assessment system, which I would argue describes Overwatch's ranking system. Is the Dunning-Kruger effect applicable in scenarios where different respondents might have different levels of control over the outcomes that they get that are then used to assess their real skill? If we accept the premise that the respondents to the study generally agreed with, which is that the support role is the least impactful in Overwatch 2, then it would be pretty logical to argue that support players have the least control over their outcomes of the games on average. From there, it's logical to argue that the magnified gap between real and perceived skills for supports compared to damage players and tanks isn't actually a reflection of people becoming more delusional about their abilities when they play support. It's a reflection of people feeling like they don't have as much control over outcomes as they do on other roles. The perception of tanks as having the most potential to impact the outcomes of matches would also back this assessment up. Everyone generally agreed that the tanks were the most capable of impacting the outcome of a match in this study, including the tanks, and tanks had the weakest Dunning-Kruger effect. We could interpret this data to argue that it's not that supports are more delusional or that tank players are the least delusional, but rather that tank players on average feel like they're more capable of impacting the outcomes of matches, and so their assessed skills feel like they're probably a lot closer to their perceived ones, while supports on average feel like they're less capable of impacting the outcomes of matches, and so their assessed real skill feels like it's not a ranking that was the result of their actions. But we could also flip that and say that even if you agree with the premise that supports were the least capable of having an impact on the outcome of a match, that doesn't mean that they're not capable of having a sizable impact on the outcome. Like, hypothetically, on a team of 5 in Overwatch 2, if every player carried exactly 20% of the responsibility for how a game turned out, then they'd have equal potential for impact. However, let's say that distribution was 18%, 18%, 20%, 20%, and 24%. Supports carrying 18% each, damage players carrying 20% each, and the tanks carrying 24%. In that scenario, it is simultaneously true that support players have the least potential for impact, but also still have a sizable impact on the outcome. Just because it's maybe less than the other two roles doesn't mean it's less by a lot, or that the total potential for impact is marginal. I mean, just speaking from personal experience, you can absolutely feel it when your supports are doing a really good job. It's not like their contribution is negligible. We also have to acknowledge there's a pretty big difference between people feeling like supports have the least impact and it actually being factually, objectively true. Sure, the respondents to my survey felt like it was true that supports had the least potential for impacting the outcome of a match, but even if the entire Overwatch player base universally agreed with that, would that make it true? At the end of the day, how would you even hope to begin trying to quantify the relative average impact of each role in any sort of objective way? Also, crucially, it wasn't just that low-ranked supports showed a larger than average Dunning-Kruger effect. It was actually kind of the opposite. In Bronze, the tanks were a little bit more delusional than the supports were, and in Silver, it was the damage players solidly ahead of the supports. In Gold, all three roles converged in the same spot, and then they diverged, with damage and tank gaps shrinking much faster than the support gaps did for Platinum, Diamond, Masters, even Grandmasters. Even the supports who are succeeding under this system, the ones who have the higher ranks, the ones who are above average, the ones who are generally getting good results, still feel screwed over. We can argue all day about whether or not supports have as much potential as tanks or damage players in terms of impacting outcomes, but the facts are the facts. The data shows that supports, regardless of rank, have larger gaps between real and perceived skill, above the average across all roles at most ranks. It feels like I've kind of been arguing in circles with myself here for a bit now. Like, why is it so hard to come to a conclusion about this? After all, we've established that the Dunning-Kruger effect is present among Overwatch 2 players in a way that generally matches the pattern of Dunning-Kruger in other contexts. And we've established that the gap between real and perceived skills is larger on average for supports than it is for damage players or for tanks. Wasn't that the point of the study? Well, yeah, the research question that was posed by the study was in fact answered. But this video is also kind of about the flaws inherent to this sort of study and the risks that can come from trying to extrapolate data beyond what the data empirically proves. Part 4. The flaws. Half an hour or so ago, I told you that I would discuss the flaws of the study with you, and I intend to do just that. Not just to cover my own ass from bad faith commenters, although they wouldn't have gotten this far anyways, but also because it's important to understand the limitations of studies like this and how to evaluate them critically. Scientific studies are rarely able to offer definitive answers to questions about how human beings behave because human beings are conscious creatures influenced by a million external variables that change how we see the world and respond to what we're seeing. So, let's talk flaws. The first flaw to discuss is that this is an exploratory pilot study. It is not a full study. A pilot study isn't conducted to answer a question definitively, only to explore the question and see if it merits conducting a full study. Research is time-consuming and expensive, and a pilot study is a good way to see if a theory is worth exploring further. But it cannot definitively answer a question, and a big reason for it, at least in this study, is because of sampling. This study used what's called the convenience sampling technique to find respondents, which is the scientific way of saying that I posted about it on YouTube and Twitter asking for people to fill out the survey and just took whatever I got. Convenience sampling is a qualitative technique. It's used for qualitative research where the goal isn't to provide generalizable results about a larger population. This study is not one of those. This was trying to answer a quantitative question with a qualitative sampling technique, which means that my data ended up being a bit wonky. My audience on YouTube, for example, is 86% male, 12.1% female, and 1.1% user specified according to my analytics, and that's a little bit reflected in my study's demographics. Of the 62 damage respondents, 50 were male, 6 were female, and 6 identified as either non-binary or another respondent submitted term. Of the 48 tank respondents, 39 were male, 4 were female, and 5 were non-binary or another respondent term. Of the 69 support respondents, 54 were male, 7 were female, and 8 were non-binary or another respondent submitted term. Aside from the fact that these are not remotely representative of the actual gender demographics of human beings, we also don't know how close or far they were from the Overwatch 2 player base's actual gender demographics. We also have to consider age. 49.2% of my audience are between the ages of 18 and 24 on YouTube, with another 3.1% being younger than that. Fun fact, I didn't actually realize that I'm older than my average viewer until the moment I looked this up to include it in the script, and I think it's the first time I've genuinely realized that I'm getting older. However, I have about 18 hours between when I'm writing this and when the video needs to go live, so that existential crisis is just gonna have to wait for a bit. When it came to the study of the 179 total responses, 24 came from respondents aged 12 to 17, 125 came from respondents aged 18 to 24, 34 came from the respondents aged 25 to 34, and 3 came from respondents aged 35 to 44. Nobody 45 or older responded to the study, which is unsurprising given that only about 6.7% of my viewers on this channel are over that age. Honestly, I was a little bit shocked that it was that high to begin with. Either way, again, this isn't really representative of the age demographics of the real world, and since Blizzard doesn't really provide this data, there's no way to know whether the age demographics of Overwatch 2 match up with this at all. Honestly, it's pretty likely that Blizzard doesn't actually know either. Since this is a quantitative study, I ideally would have used a quantitative sampling technique, which are techniques generally based around finding a representative sample of the population in question to ask. For this one, since there's no master list of eligible respondents, the ideal sampling technique probably would have been something called multi-stage cluster sampling. This video is already way too long, and we've already gotten boring enough with some of this stuff, but the TLDR description of it is that it basically just involves identifying as many potential respondents as possible, clustering them based on whatever identifiers you're trying to control for, and then trying to get a proportional number of respondents from each relevant cluster so you can do everything in your power to get accurate, generally applicable data. Speaking of some of that data, like age and gender, this study also didn't exhaust all other potential variables that could have influenced the outcome. For example, I did ask respondents to tell me the heroes they played in order of most to least played in the first season, but there wasn't enough data in each one to definitively make any claims about a relationship or lack of relationship between people playing certain heroes in the Dunning-Kruger effect. I also didn't check to see if this trend was different depending on the region people played in. Is this effect equal across Asia, Europe, and Americas? Is it different? Does it change regionally within those servers? This survey was also only offered in English, and given that my videos are also in English, this survey probably doesn't have many respondents from countries or regions where English isn't a common language, or for people who don't tend to watch English language content. In a more complete study, these variables and way more of them would be explored to see whether or not any of them were contributing to this. It also didn't reach people who don't use YouTube or Twitter, meaning that I pulled my respondents from a population who are likely to be tuned into the discourse surrounding Overwatch to some extent, which might have influenced people's feelings. Maybe respondents who weren't invested in Overwatch Twitter or Overwatch YouTube would have felt differently. Another important critique that needs to be made of this study and its findings is that it's only really applicable to the first competitive season of Overwatch 2. This study was conducted while the second season was ongoing, but respondents were only asked to submit data about the first season. This was done to ensure that data was only being collected about a fully completed season. However, Overwatch 2 changes over time. In the second season, supports were playing Dead by Daylight, Sombra, Genji, and others had been on the receiving end of some pretty brutal nerfs, a few other heroes got some buffs, Roadhog was making everyone miserable, the Sojourn Mercy duo meta was becoming even more entrenched, and Ramatra was added to the game, among many other things that happened that season. If I ran this study again today and asked people to answer the same questions about the second season, would the results be different? What about in the third season that's ongoing? The first season was also the first season of competitive 5v5, which meant everyone was still getting used to the new format. It was also the first season with Sojourn and Kiriko and Junker Queen, two of whom ended up being pretty massively influential in the meta for that season. Most players were also playing Push for the first time, as well as learning a bunch of new maps. The game moved to free-to-play, and a bunch of new people joined. Maybe in a different season with a different map pool, different heroes would have performed better, and people would have had different feelings about it. And maybe once all the free-to-play players were gone, it would have felt like it was a bit more of a fair system, or, they were more reliably able to put people in the right ranks. Speaking of, the game was also brand new, and people's ranks got a bit of a reset. It's entirely possible that a lot of people felt like they should have had higher ranks, and were entirely correct. They just didn't have 20 hours a week to grind from an initial low placement to where they typically would be. Maybe if I redid this study for a later season, the gap between real and perceived skills would have shrunk because players would have had more time to close the gap by either ranking up or by getting enough data to reevaluate their perceived skill level. When assessing whether a quantitative study is actually generalizable to a larger population, we also have to consider whether or not the study has considered temporality. Namely, does the study account for things changing over time? When we consider that Overwatch gets a balanced patch roughly once a month on average, a small mid-season patch and then a bigger one between seasons, more research would need to be done on future seasons to see if the trends actually hold. If they don't, we would have to explain why and that it might ultimately change our outcomes. The problem with trying to do that is that, as mentioned a few times already, this study required me to deceive people. If people knew that they were answering a study about the Dunning-Kruger effect, it would have either consciously or unconsciously influenced the responses that they gave, and some people just wouldn't have responded at all. I've let the cat out of the bag. I can't run this study again with, a neutral audience. You've been tainted. So it becomes really hard to see whether or not this data is actually true. If I ran the study again and I saw that the gap decreased, would that be because, the Dunning-Kruger effect got weaker, or would it be because people knew what I was talking about now? The last point that I'm going to make about the flaws of this study, and this is probably the most general critique of academic studies as a whole, is that researchers are inherently biased, because bias is inherent to being human. And it's not just the researchers, it's also the people who try and analyze their studies and apply them to real-world scenarios or report on them, whether those people are journalists, YouTubers, politicians, or anyone else. That doesn't mean that they're worthless, but it does mean that you need to remember that the person conducting the research will have a perspective on the world, and it's going to be one that's probably at least a little bit different than you. You will need to account for that. In conducting this study, my own experiences, both with Overwatch and, with my education, with my lived experiences, they all colored the questions that I asked and how I interpreted the data. It doesn't mean that the data isn't real, but whenever you're reviewing a study, it's important to keep an eye out for areas where bias might be creeping in so you can account for it in your own analysis. How did I phrase my questions? Were there questions that I didn't ask that I should have? Were there questions that I asked that I shouldn't have? Did I place too much importance on one answer and not enough on another? These are knowable biases. They're identifiable. You can see what I've done, you can interpret it, and you can try and account for my biases in your own analysis. That's the easy side of it. The much more difficult question is, what kind of bias do I have that wasn't exposed because I handled it behind the scenes? I've mentioned a few times now that not every respondent was included in this study, but I have been very careful to avoid explicitly mentioning what criteria I used to exclude people because I wanted to be able to make this point at the end of the video. Who did I exclude? Which respondents filled out the survey but had their responses deleted from consideration? There was a pretty sizable number of them, I can tell you that much. Did you ever stop to think that I might be doing so I could, delete data that would have contradicted my narrative? What could I have to gain from the conclusion that I came to that might have incentivized me to mess with the data? Before I brought it up at this point, did you question it? Dramatics aside, I only deleted the responses where they were genuinely unusable. Some people selected multiple ranks for their final rank or for their season high rank, or they just didn't play enough games in the season to receive actual placements, or they were clearly just trolling. All usable data that I was given was used in the study. I also want to make it clear that I'm not trying to say that there's a conspiracy behind every study. Sometimes a study is going to tell you something you don't want to hear or disagree with, and it's because you're wrong. Sometimes a study will tell you something that you do agree with, but the study is poorly executed and fatally flawed, and it doesn't actually prove your point. A study being flawed also doesn't mean that its conclusions are inherently useless. It just means that that study doesn't prove them either way. Academic research, academic studies, all that sort of stuff should be considered with a critical lens, not necessarily an inherently suspicious one or an inherently trusting one, just one based in a sentiment of, I should see if the conclusions drawn by the researcher are backed up by the data. The problem with that is that sometimes you're not going to be smart enough to do it. You won't know enough about the subject matter, you won't know enough about data analysis, whatever. It happens. In those instances, you gotta find people who are smart enough to do that. Not everyone can be an expert in everything, and if you're unsure, ask. Frankly, a lot of researchers are surprisingly willing to field questions about their work so long as you're respectful and ask clear questions. Honestly, at this point, I'm not really sure what the takeaway from the video is supposed to be anymore. Is it that the Dunning-Kruger effect is real and can be seen in Overwatch? Is it that supports are more susceptible to it? Is it that the Dunning-Kruger effect doesn't actually mean what people tend to think it means? Is it that the Dunning-Kruger effect has some pretty glaring flaws as a concept when applied to something like Overwatch? Or is it that those flaws are themselves potentially just an example of how someone might cope with being a low-skill player in a state of denial that only reinforces the argument for it being the Dunning-Kruger effect? Is it about the importance of evaluating research and academic papers with a critical lens and providing some reasons for why you should do that? Is this whole video just me trying to convince people that I'm smart? Who knows? The video is out in the world now, and at the end of the day, I can't force a takeaway on you. You are all horses that I have led to water. I cannot make you drink it or like the taste of it, but I hope you enjoyed the ride to get here at least. And with that dumb metaphor, this is going to be the end of the video. This was a stupidly long one, so if you managed to get to the end, thank you very much for watching all the way through, including the time that I spent planning and executing the study for school and writing the actual original pilot study, like 12,000 word thing. This video has been in the works for over a month at this point, and I hope that you found the subject matter as interesting as I did. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, leave a comment, share it on Twitter, all those good things that the algorithm loves. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/thevivaros to catch my streams. You can find links to all my socials in the description if you want more from me. Thanks again for watching, and I hope I'll see you again soon.